Er den det? Godt. Så tror jeg, vi er der, hvor vi kan sige, at vi går i gang. This afternoon will be sort of a part Danish, part English language exercise. So we'll swap in Danish and English along the way for the next 2 hours. Først og fremmest, rigtig hjertelig velkommen. Tak fordi I vil bruge nogle regnfulde timer sammen med os. Vi var i morges 35 konfirmerede tilmeldte, men jeg tror, vi må konstatere, at covid-19 har lagt sin, skal vi kalde det, klamme hånd på ikke bare vores arrangement i eftermiddag, men også rigtig, rigtig mange andre. Men de af jer, der er kommet, selvfølgelig tak, fordi I vil være med til det her eksperiment, som jeg tror, jeg vil kalde det. Sagen er, at i lyset af, at vi skulle have været flere, så kan I se, at vi har stillet tingene frem, sådan som man hør og bør, og der er sprit rundt omkring, og vi skal bede om at tage hensyn til afstanden her. Vi gør det så godt vi kan for nu at være fysisk sammen, men når vi ikke er flere, end vi er her, så tror jeg ikke, at den del kommer til at blive noget problem. Jeg skal også sige, at når jeg står med mikrofon på, selv i det her lille rum, så er det fordi, vi livestreamer, så de, der ikke har mulighed for at komme, men har lyst til at se eftermiddagens program hjemmefra fra YouTube, har mulighed for det. Så velkommen til alle de, der måtte se arrangementet her livestreamen. Hvis vi skruer tiden tilbage til januar, så gennemførte vi 3 forskellige workshops. Mikkel vil komme ind på det lige om lidt. Nogle af jer deltog i workshoppen. Hvor mange herinde, jeg har lige behov for at se, hvor mange af jer deltog tilbage i januar på de workshops, vi afholdt? Der var 1, 2, 3, 4, ja. Så det er sådan en tredjedel, lidt mere end da. Og det er fint, fordi så vil vi selvfølgelig tage nogle af de emner op, som I, der var her i januar, kan huske. Så annoncerede vi på sidste dagen, at vi vil lave den her launch, vi laver i dag, i slutningen af januar. I slutningen af februar. Og 1, 2, 3 skulle vi alle sammen lære at stave til covid-19, og så behøver jeg ikke at sige mere, hvorfor vi først er oppe og køre i dag. Og så selvfølgelig ramt her af det, der så ligner anden bølge. Men vi klemmer på. Vi sætter i søen nu, og det gør vi i et samarbejde med BLOXHUB, som jeg er ansvarlig for. Helly? No, Danish. Yes. Jeg hedder Torben Klitgaard, direktør i BLOXHUB. Mikkel Thomasen kommer fra Smith Innovation. Og lige om lidt, så vil vi møde Indy Johar fra London, som er den 3. aktør i vores Boring Revolution Lab. Der er måske mange, der har spurgt mig, hvorfor boring? Hvad i alverden har I gang i her? Og pointen er jo ikke, at vi er kommet for at kede os, eller sådan falde lidt i søvn en træt eftermiddag. Pointen er, at vi med The Boring Revolution Lab gerne vil tage fat i nogle fundamentale problemstillinger, nogle strukturelle problemstillinger, nogle finansieringsdiskussioner, nogle risikostyringsafdækningsdiskussioner, altså noget, som ligger nedenunder, så at sige, hele den måde, vi organiserer byggeriet på. Og det er det, der har gjort, at vi har dristet os til at sige, det er ikke den sexede, designmæssige produktudvikling, det er ikke de nyeste produkter, vi skal have fat i her. Det er det, der kører nedenunder i byggeriet, som vi forudsætter en ændring af, for at vi for alvor kan få branchen til at vækste. Men vi vil gøre det på den måde, at vi vil lave det her lab, og labbet vil i sig selv blive en række aktiviteter. Vi har i BLOXHUB allerede flere forskellige labs. Vi har det, vi kalder et Circle House Lab, som har fokus på cirkulær økonomi, som består lidt af det samme, som vi gerne vil lave med jer og andre interesserede. Jeg tror, jeg tager mine briller af. Nemlig en række forskellige workshops, vi inviterer ind til, med henblik på at fokusere på vigtige emner, som vi i fællesskab nu senere i dag identificerer, at vi ønsker at køre videre med. Vi har også fornøjelsen af at introducere her senere på måneden det, vi kalder et PropTech Lab, som bliver et fysisk lab for små PropTech startups, altså små virksomheder, tech startups, der skal producere og udvikle teknologiløsninger ind til ejendomsbranchen. Så i BLOXHUB regi har vi en række forskellige labs. Nogle er fysiske i form af virksomhederne bor her, og andre består af møder, af workshops, som i det her tilfælde The Boring Revolution Lab. Og når vi gerne vil fokusere på det her emne, så er det jo ikke fordi, at det ikke er blevet drøftet før i branchen. Men vi vil tillade os i de rammer, vi sætter op her, at prøve at stille nogle spørgsmål, som nogen måske vil sige, det kan I godt glemme alt om, det kommer vi aldrig til at ændre. Men vi tillader os alligevel at stille grundlæggende spørgsmål om, hvorfor kigger vi ikke på de her ting? Hvorfor forsøger vi ikke at ændre grundlaget for den måde, vi bygger på, den måde, vi arbejder på, den måde, vi samarbejder på? Og lad mig bare nævne 3 korte eksempler. Mikkel vil også komme ind på det, og vi vil arbejde med det senere i dag. Altså, hvad er det, der gør, at man ikke kan honorere byggeriets aktører efter den værdi, der skabes, snarere end det antal timer, man lægger ind i de enkelte projekter? Særligt på rådgiversiden, men selvfølgelig også på entreprenørsiden og på driftssiden, sådan set hele byggeriets værdikæde, skabes der værdi hele tiden. Hvorfor fokuserer vi ikke på den output og det værdi, der skabes som udgangspunkt for, hvad det er for nogle ydelser og services, som rådgiverne og de aktører i byggeriet lægger ind i arbejdet. Så vi vil gerne med den her diskussion blandt andet prøve at gå fra et input-fokuseret paradigme til et output og et værdibaseret paradigme. Hvorfor udregner man ikke kvadratmeterleje eller lejekontrakter i det hele taget ud fra igen den værdi, disse kvadratmeter skaber for de lejere, der lejer sig ind i lejemål? Hvorfor er nøgletallene kvadratmeter og antal kontorpladser? Hvorfor er det ikke den forretningsmæssige værdi, som lejemålet skaber for de virksomheder, som udgør lejemålet? Sådan nogle spørgsmål kunne vi også godt tænke os at stille. Og vi kunne også godt tænke os at stille spørgsmål omkring finansieringsmodeller til store infrastrukturelle projekter, som vi ved, vi står overfor i de kommende mange år. Kystsikring har vi diskuteret helt tilbage i januar, det kommer vi også til at gøre lidt mere senere. Men hvad er det, der gør, at vi ikke kan kigge på andre alternative finansieringsmodeller, risikoafdækningsmodeller, når vi snakker om store infrastrukturelle udgifter og anlægsprojekter i fremtiden? Vi ved, at kommunerne i det vestjyske ikke har råd til de kystsikringsprojekter, de står overfor. Hvad kan vi gøre for at udtænke nye modeller? Hvad kan vi gøre for at booste, så at sige, den form for anlægsprojekter fremadrettet? Det kan vi kun, hvis vi prøver at lægge, så at sige, tage jakken af, prøve at forlade den her mere konventionelle visdom om, hvordan man har gjort tidligere, og det er det, vi tillader os at gøre i vores lab. Så det sted, som vi gerne vil skabe nu her fysisk hos os, de aktiviteter, vi gerne vil lave fremadrettet med jer, det er eksperimenter. Vi ved ikke, hvor vi lander. Vi ved ikke nødvendigvis præcis, hvad det resulterer i, men vi våger skindet, og vi stikker næsen frem for at sige, at vi vil gerne prøve at lave nogle fundamentale ændringer på den praksis, vi har i byggeriet i dag. Og derfor så her til sidst forestiller vi os der har forberedt i dag, at når vi kommer mod slutningen her om et par timer, knap og nap, jamen så vil vi have inddæmmet, så at sige, nogle emner, som vi gerne vil arbejde videre med i mindre grupper. Vi håber også, at covid-19 på et tidspunkt forlader landet, så vi kan få de mindre grupper til at blive større, med henblik på, at vi må mødes igen. Men I skal se for jer en lancering i dag, og dermed også en lancering af nogle emner. Jeg har været inde på nogle af dem, og dermed en lancering af en række mindre aktiviteter. Nogle af aktiviteterne kan vi søge funding til. Nogle af aktiviteterne kan være, I vil tage ansvaret for, og måske huse i jeres virksomheder, og et cetera. Så vi sætter nogle små speedbåde i søen på baggrund af den her lancering, vi har i dag. Og det vi så skal i dag, det er, at vi skal igennem programmet her. Nu er jeg lidt udfordret af mine briller. Jeg ved ikke, om I kender den med glidende overgang. Det fik jeg aldrig ind i de her briller, så det er derfor, jeg skal have med på hele tiden. Men jeg er færdig nu efter min velkomst, og forhåbentlig sådan en indflyvning til, hvorfor er vi her i dag. Så vil vi stille om Gud og teknikken vel til London, til Indy Johar, og de der var her i januar, kan huske Indy som en international kapacitet på det her område, der insisterer på at tænke upstream, kan man sige, tænke på tværs af eksisterende praksiser og eksisterende systemer i byggeriet. Indy, så sent som i går aftes, skulle egentlig have taget et fly for at komme herover, men tingene ændrer sig på nærmest timebasis, og derfor så stiller vi om 2 sekunder til Indy. Bagefter så vil Mikkel introducere, hvad er det så, der skal ske resten af dagen, hvad er det for nogle sessions, vi gerne vil have jer til at diskutere. Og her havde vi forestillet os med 35 sign-ups, et stort, flot gruppeformat. Lad os lige se, hvordan vi rent praktisk gør det. Det skal vi nu nok... Et lille godt gruppeformat, ja. Hvad var det, du sagde? For det kan godt være, at vi ikke starter med The Boring Revolution, men The Quiet Revolution i lyset af, at rammerne er sådan. Og derfor så går vi ud i små breakouts her mod slutningen af seancen, og så summer vi op, når klokken bliver lidt i 5, og så vil der være en øl og et glas vin til de jer, der har lyst til at blive bagefter, så vi kan netværke lidt en lille smule efterfølgende. Det kan jo også være, at regnen tager til, sådan så I rigtig, rigtig gerne vil blive her rigtig længe. Det skal I i givet fald være velkommen til. But with that Danish introduction, I would like to move to Indy Johar. Can you hear me, Indy? Perfect. Excellent. Could you pump up the volume, so to speak? Because I think would you test the volume?
Hello.
I'll check out here with the tech department. Could you help us with the volume? Okay, cool. So what is the Boring Revolution Lab for? How are we going to work in the future? And what sort of fundamental whys are we going to tackle within the activities of the Boring Revolution Lab? But I would like you to start off before you give us your reflections. Give us just a little bit of feeling about what is it like living in London these days. Would you start out there? Can we do something about the volume? Okay. Just a sec, Indy. That's better. Is that okay? Yeah, I think everyone can hear you and we can see you. So the stage is yours.
Great. So London. Like many places, the biggest structural question for London is how it changes much more at a deeper level. So obviously, if you look at it at a structural level, the central business district in terms of London, if you have a 30% reduction in the use of the City of London and Westminster, you have really a different economy. If you have a 30% or maybe 60% reduction in retail, because as a result of that, you have a fundamentally different idea of what the central London really operates. By implication, transportation infrastructure, TfL, are struggling because actually there's not enough journeys are going into London, which means the kind of public transport infrastructure is now at a state of loss-making infrastructure. So I think we're in a bit of my view is it's much more that the COVID transition has triggered us into a new economy and has cascaded us into a new economic geography. And I think that has some big implications for London, both in terms of, yes, the kind of central business district, but also the thesis of housing, because I think houses were designed as a place to sleep in and go to work in, go to sleep in and maybe store some goods, but not necessarily a place to work in. So I think we're going to see some shifts in the economic geography. Outer London boroughs and outer London high streets have got 20% more revenue in terms of there's sort of people buying much more locally as opposed to buying in the centre. So I would argue that we're in the middle of a transition of a very particular idea of the city to a different idea of the city. And I think London is grappling to deal with this sort of transition because I think it has some fundamental implications both for equality, the nature of work, what the assets are, what the commercial assets value is in the central London, how you wipe that off, with a lot of developers saying how to, with lots of vested interests now focused on central London, people talk about how you preserve the central London economy, which might be at the end of its cycle. So I think there's some interesting questions on the table. So, that's a kind of quick London perspective of where we are.
Thank you.
Shall I kick into the main story?
Please.
That would be helpful. So, I suppose I'm going to start by. I want to start by just talking about why I think this is a really critical issue, and in a way, the Boring Revolution Lab, which has been put together by ourselves, Smith and BLOXHUB, I think is fundamentally about looking deeper at the nature of problems that we face. A little bit about dark matter labs, We're pretty much a global team, situated from Montreal to some, to all the way in, actually people in Copenhagen, but also in South Korea, Budapest, Berlin, various other parts of the world. So we're kind of quite a distributed. We're part of the 00 network, which I helped build. We built OpenDesk, open source furniture company, open source housing, an architecture company, including having built multiple impact hubs, which are kind of collaborative workspaces for social impact. These are some of the things that we've done. Over the last few years, we became very interested in what I would call as dark matter, the stuff behind things, the rules mechanisms, the institutional mechanisms, the contractual mechanisms that actually govern our reality. Largely on the basis that actually we could imagine new products, but what was holding many things back, whether you look at the sort of self-printing or the kind of printed house, the 3D printed house, the problem was not the house, the problem was the nature of the land economy and how it's structured, or the warranty infrastructure that sat behind it. So there's a really, for me, there's been a real structural issue about actually looking at that dark matter. And in a way, I think when we look at the kind of COVID situation, what I think I would say is that actually, if we look at COVID as a kind of structural trigger, we're in a transition point. Obviously, there's been massive amounts of human lives lost, and I think these numbers are now out of date significantly so. The economic impact, like I was mentioning, the economic impact is the Britain is facing the worst recession in 300 years, 1709, I think. And then social inequalities, pretty much many places are increasing. I know that places like Copenhagen and Denmark and Sweden are not facing anywhere near a severe impact, but I think if you look at the cumulative effects globally, I think we'll start to see something quite significant. I think it's also worth recognizing this is part of a bigger transition. I think what COVID has laid bare the fragility of the existing system. It's laid bare, I think, that we are in an age of long emergencies. It's laid bare some of the systemic issues on the table. And it's also laid bare that I think we're in a kind of transition, if you look at the kind of fourth wave of the crisis, the psychological trauma, the mental illness and the kind of impacts, the economic injury, the burnout. And I think we are going to see a significant transition in our, I think, our thesis of the city and placemaking as we move into the next round. And I think by that implication, we have to think harder. But it needs to be looked at a much broader level. I would say that COVID is a trigger for a bunch of systemic risks that we're operating, whether it's nutrition decline, species extinction, labour market informalization, demographic dividend liabilities in terms of actually middle class wages and how they're operationalizing, environmental violence and climate change impacts. All these things are parts of externalities that our system has been generating as a result of some of the structural deep code errors that are actually operationalized in our reality. So one of the kind of challenges that we were looking at as we were kind of collectively looking at the deep code, kind of in a way, how we look at the kind of deep code errors, and one of that structure of any thesis is that actually if you look at the kind of the future destruction of common resources, future liabilities, the externalities.
Indy, can you hear me?
Obviously, climate change is just one failure point. One failure point for, and there are many others, we know this, right? And the future liabilities we're generating, risks we're generating for future generations. And these are kind of manifest, whether it's an rise in antibacterial resistance, chronic nearby as well, which I desperately miss. So what you find is that actually the value of something is not just about the intrinsic value of land, but the monopolistic access that those provides. So when we start to look at these things become critical in terms of how we understand the future. I want to give you a practical example of this, just to I'm going to take you down a little wormhole. This, as many of you will recognize, as the High Line in New York, very, very famous. We did the analysis on looking at how what impact did the High Line have on land value. And what we realized very quickly was that actually the High Line massively impacted local land value. In fact, so much so that if you just took 10% of the land value uplift directly attributable to the High Line, right? Discounting all of New York, discounting everything else, you just took 10% of the land value uplift attributable to the High Line, you would have paid for the High Line in just under 10 months. So what you start to realize is that social goods, social civic assets create huge amounts of spillover value. How do you understand that value? How do you contract that? How do you organize that? Became a really interesting thing. And so we've been exploring this. How do you pick apart in a way, the land economy and unbundle the property rights that we conveniently bundled into different formats? How do you challenge the investment model, which means that in infrastructure investment, whether it's social, civic, hard tech mobility infrastructure, which we often do this for mobility infrastructure, but how do you do it for other software infrastructures and the kind of value distribution that they drive? How do you organize it that actually can create a new form of powerful model? Now, in a way, Copenhagen's been doing some of this stuff already with the actual construction of the underground and metros and other things. You've been looking at some of these kind of models. What we've been exploring is how do you do that digitally? How do you go to construct that at the level of a park? When we know a park, for example, even a simple park constructs huge amount of land value uplift persistently on the adjacent houses and that infrastructure. So what are the smart covenants? And one of the things that we've realized is that new forms of technology give us the framework to be able to bury, say, on a digital title deed, smart covenants, which are able to look at the land value uplift attributable to an intervention, and be able to share that value uplift at the point of transaction back into paying for those civic assets. Realizes this requires digital infrastructure, whether it's from digital IDs to ownership structures and geospatial data, all the way to some of the transaction APIs, and then obviously the smart contracts. And this can allow for us to look at digital uplift. It can allow us to be able to contract some of those values. Now, this is one particular example. And this is not universally applicable because of lots of things about how land economies are structured in different parts of the world. But it's a very interesting example to be able to look at the principle of shared investment being attributed to either the uplift in value or the delta in what the risks are. So, for example, if Copenhagen had some intervention, so I think New York, let's use New York just to keep ourselves slightly distant. New York is looking to invest something like 80 billion to protect the land value of New York in flood defenses. That 80 billion will effectively construct the land value. Without that 80 billion, that land value tends towards zero. So how do you start to put together these infrastructures in these new relationships becomes really interesting. And that also doesn't just apply to tangible infrastructures, also applies to non-tangible infrastructure. So the result of healthcare costs. So we know housing has a direct cost on poor housing has a direct cost on healthcare. How do we start to link those liabilities in really radical formats? Again, if you look at the finance gap, say, for example, in trees, how do we start to reimagine trees and the benefits that those trees provide, whether it's in terms of actual direct benefits, stormwater retention, energy savings, but also looking at other issues, whether it's walkability, biodiversity improvement, soil regeneration. So how do we start to construct actually new economies around these assets becomes really vital. And how do you attribute those beneficiaries through contracts? So what we're really interested in is what do those smart contracts look like around these infrastructures? So Milan, for example, is looking to invest in building 1 million trees in the city because it recognizes heat island effects are going to be a significant issue for European cities. So when you're looking to invest in 1 million trees throughout the city to be able to actually deal with heat island effects, how do you construct the value? How do you share the value? How do you build these system level contracts to around these new what we'll call intangible or soft civic infrastructures. How do you finance them? They become critical. And that becomes part of the thing that we've been looking at and we are going to be looking at together in the Boring Revolution Lab. For us, the problem is not the trees, it's actually the boring stuff around it and the ability to construct those realities that becomes critical. And that applies not only at the level of, what I would say, the contracted value, but also the nature of that value. So should a tree be a public asset? So there's, again, some really amazing work going on around the world where, for example, rivers in New Zealand that have been turned into self-sovereign, sort of a granted rights of personhood, all the way through to in the United States to Ecuador, and we're seeing this sort of transition where nature no longer is just a resource, but is now a person, a citizens. How do we start to have a new type of relationship with those kind of actors becomes really critical. So this is not just about the financial infrastructure, but it's actually about recognition of new identities and actors in the system. So historically, non-economic actors become economic actors, and I think that starts to position a new type of reality in terms of how we engage. And this also builds on new contracting infrastructure, new capabilities, how machines and people and machines collaborating in new formats, and how do you construct a kind of collective and AI assisted economy? What do those look like? Again, we're part of building a piece of work which is going to be launched soon around civic AI, and the role of these kind of collective intelligence and artificial intelligence frameworks becomes really critical in being able to operationalize that. And that operationalizes across lots and lots of civic assets that actually, and for me, civic assets are assets that create multi-stakeholder value for multiple actors and our ability to contract in those civic value is increasingly possible. Because I think what has become very, very clear is we've moved from what I would call a private economy to a civic economy. A private economy was constructed around contracting between two people. A civic economy is contracting many people, contracting to many people with many people. The ability to do that as a result of machine contracting allows us to be able to construct new value models that were historically impossible to understand. And that relies on us reimagining some of the structural issues that I think we've all been talking about in the paper that I think you've just been issued. And that applies all the way through to work like, for example, a free house. Let's imagine a house which is no longer functioned on the thesis of you buying the house or selling the house, but is structured on the basis of a perpetual bond to which you have a treaty or a right to use a stewardship model with the relationship of the house as opposed to you owning the house. And we can start to talk about self-sovereign houses in these realities. So increasingly, the convergence of new technology, new sensibilities about self-sovereign, non-economic, historically non-economic actors and post-human actors starts to come together to create whole new economies of value, which recognizes those theses in really radical ways. So, for example, whilst the land may be structured through a perpetual bond, the house will almost certainly be structured through a smart service comfort contract. Again, this is work that we're doing. And if it's a comfort contract, which is perpetually owned or serviced by the contractor or passed through by the contractor, you start to have a completely different relationship to the maintenance economy and the circular economy. So this kind of unbundling of the house into its multiple relationships and the digitization of those frameworks fundamentally starts to transform the house, as well as the rights of obligation to public good in terms of ecological services that the house is providing to the system and ecological intensification services that the house is providing or that land is providing to the local community. So you can start to reimagine these formats. And one of the key things for us is that we often talk about nice architectural images, but actually and beautiful architectural images of what the future needs to look like. But it's clear to us is only if we can change the contractual landscape around the house do we transform the house. Some of you, maybe a few of you, are architects, and the thesis has historically been, form follows function. I think our thesis here increasingly in the Boring Revolution Lab is form follows contract. And the really smart conversation right now is that the contract is being transformed as a result of actually some of the opportunities that are on the table. And I want to put this in context with actually some of the some of the work that's going on also in looking at next generation investors. So we've been doing quite a bit of work with next generation net investors. And one of the things you find out is that increasingly investors are saying it's not about sort of just shaping products and services. It's as much, they are looking at whole sector transformations. And so investment into shaping sectors, investing into shaping markets, investment into shaping societies becomes kind of an investment for impact theory for increasing the next generation of high wealth individuals. We currently don't have the portfolios and the investment structures to be able to take that model. But the reality is, from the investment side, there's increasingly recognition value is no longer going to be stored at the product level, but at a systems level. And I think that's a really key issue. It's also worth recognizing where I think Copenhagen, Denmark, and the Scandic countries have a really important lead, is that actually, where are people looking to invest? They're looking to invest in deep democracies. And so the construction of this technological reality is not just a problem of technology, it's also a construction of deep democracies in those technologies. So look at that differential. 75% were preferring deep democracies when they were looking for long-term returns. And why is that? Because democracies, the thesis is that deep democracies have the ability to renew themselves at higher refresh rates than many other societies. The question is, have any of us really built those infrastructures? But this is really critical for any of the technological stories that we are building and capacities we're building. Finally, just to sort of put some other thesis on it, this is again an investment perspective. If you're investing in a 100-year bond, where would you invest? Fascinating to think that they were investing in education, health, two intangibles. Currently, the public health of a society is an intangible public asset, which isn't really valued on anyone's balance sheet, and neither is education. Natural ecosystems are also currently not really on the balance sheet of any location. So what we're seeing is investors really start to think about these intangible assets and future asset classes and natural ecosystems as being key value adds. Then obviously you've got agriculture and other things, but you can start to see how people are starting to think about the future in really different formats. So what I've done there thus far is start to give you hopefully a bit of background and a feel into this conversation. But as we get into the grand challenge, what I want to say here is that I'm going to take you out for about 2-3 minutes into a slightly bigger conversation, because I think it's really critical. We frame the Boring Revolution Lab in what I would call is a macro context. Now, I would suggest one of the big transformations that we're in the middle of. Firstly, let's start by recognizing the current situation we're in is a self-terminating situation for society. The nature of risks that we're carrying is self-terminating. Secondly, let's also start by recognizing that the scale of challenge we're facing, the worldview that we're operating in, is still a worldview that was constructed about 350 odd years ago. That worldview saw the world as relatively infinite, and in an infinite world, it saw the world through understanding objects. We are increasingly in a world which is what I would call is a small world, and actually it's our interdependence becomes more critical than our isolated individual object nature. That transition manifests in how we see things around us. It manifests in our relationship with nature being seen not as a relationship of resource, but as a relationship of cohabitation. If we're going to reduce the amount of pandemics we're living in and other ecological disasters that we're living in, it transforms our relationship with material goods to not one of ownership, but one of stewardship. It transforms our relationship with the future to not one of colonization, but actually to be respectful of futures and also acknowledge the risk we generate for future generations. And there was a really brilliant piece of work done that, if you look at future generations of humans, there are maybe 100, I think it's nearly 150. If human civilization survives as long as it's suspected to on current predictions, there are nearly, I think it's something like an order of, I think it's something like 180 billion new humans expected into the future. So we are currently about 10 billion. So when you look into this future, you start to imagine in really radical formats. So what is our relationship with the future? Finally, what is our relationship with humans itself? I think these structural challenges are vital, and these are our relationship with the world. And in the Boring Revolution is these relationships are constructed in the contract and the conception of those relationships. And I would argue at a philosophical level, what we're seeing is a transformation as a result of both our capability, i.e., new technologies and our ability to advance that, as well as the necessity of actually that worldview coming to an end. So, at the symbiosis of this, I think we're facing a transition in our relationship with the world, which is, I think, really vital. And then you can look at that, whether that's looking at the kind of relationship to things, relationship to humans, relationship to nature, and relationship to the future stuff in the middle, and how do we start to make that sort of transition? Again, we will share slides. You've already seen the document, but just to put that in format. But that materializes, that whole stuff materializes in how do we start to operationalize the city in really basic terms. How do we start to talk about dynamic urban licensing? How do we start to reimagine procurement contracts for performance? How do we start to actually talk about a public carbon registry for materials? How do we start to make some of these things real? And those are a function of, in a way, the regulatory stack, which is really at the challenge of this boring revolution laboratory, the future of licensing, the contracting policy infrastructure, and the rights infrastructure that we talk about. So, and these manifest in everyday things, but these are the things that, we've got Finland who's doing some work on the future of budgeting, looking at 100-year budgets, 50-year budgets, 20-year budgets, 10-year budgets. We've got some really interesting work already proposed that we're going to be doing together. All of us are going to be doing together on the looking at new forms of rental contracts, which look at outcome-based rental contracts. We've got some really interesting work we're proposing around trees and natural assets, also looking at new ways of financing anti-flooding investments, looking at future provisions and sharing those future liabilities in different smart formats. So I think what we're saying is that's really the work that we're all part of. And I think in that world, it's really critical, what's our relationship with privacy and democracy? How do we start to operationalize it? How do we create the circular rights and warranties without creating new forms of monopolies from the material owners? How do we deal with the tyranny of metrics, which I think we've always historically known about? So as we approach this economy, and one of the things that we often talk about, even in the trees work, is that this is not an economy of money entirely. Some aspects of it should be about money, but some aspects of it can be about economies of gifting and other things, which can also be playfully engaged within really radical formats. So with that, I wanted to take you through that conversation on behalf of Mikael and Torben, just to sort of open up the conversation. But that just hopefully gives you a feel for the conversation we've been part of, but also opening up is why we think a boring revolution, this kind of reinvention of bureaucracy, is not only an opportunity, but it's, I think, vitally critical given the transition we're in the middle of. And I think it's a pleasure to be here, and I will be there. I've been a regular visitor of BLOXHUB and the coffee downstairs, so I will be back. But with that, I'll pause for a moment, and maybe we can move into questions.
And I hope you can all hear me, and also that you can hear me, Indy. Perfect. And we've got a bit of echo here, but that will probably get out, I hope. What we're going to do for the next 15 minutes is take some questions from the floor, including myself on the floor, and obviously to clarify things. And I can't help, now I've listened to your presentation many times, and I'm still learning, so thanks once again. I can't help to think that one way of saying what this is all about is that I think what we've seen until now is that I can't hear you right now.
Sorry,
okay. Yeah, can you hear me? Is that okay? Can you hear me? No, not the case.
This is cool. I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, you can hear me now. Okay. Well, I've been listening to your presentation many times, and it's still very encouraging, and so thank you so much for that. And
I've lost you again.
Am I doing something wrong here?
Yeah.
You can hear me now, so if I do like this, but okay. Am I doing something wrong with the mic? Okay, now it's just going to be very brief on the question. Would it be fair to say that for you the boring revolution is about how we can use new technology, digitalization and all that, not to empower the few, but to empower the many?
Yes, and also empower the many in the sense not just the traditional economic actors, but the kind of non-economic actors that we've historically ignored and exploited. So I think it's actually a new economy of things and places and environments and ecologies that I think is going to be really radical in that thesis. So I think yes, exactly, but it's broader than just more humans. I think it's broader than that, definitely.
Yeah, because I mean, that is one thing that I find very inspiring with the boring revolution. I think most of us have experienced within the last few years that a lot of the dreams that we thought was going to happen is not going to happen in the right way. It's become more of a nightmare that a few companies owning a lot, disempowering people. And I think for me, the boring revolution is about bringing the civic part back again. Yeah.
I mean, Mikhail, just to build on that, I think that's really critical because I think one of the challenges that we've had is that we've been seeing the world through the eyes of kind of smart cities, which has been, all the focus has been on the kind of digital cars and digital infrastructure. What we haven't focused sufficiently on is actually the contractual legal infrastructure base, which is, I think, if you look at the work that's happened, obviously with DLT, distributed ledger technologies, there's been a rise of that conversation. And there's been a kind of really interesting beginning of that conversation. But I think that's where you're going to see much larger transformations of what machined economies will do in terms of unlocking value and transforming that value. Now, here it is vital that democracies start to really play and really start to imagine what is democratic bureaucracies of the 21st century in the age of machined economies. And that requires us to imagine all the simple things, right? Should a surveillance camera, which is automated, should that be a public interest trust in a radical format, which does record things, but actually is legally constructed in a completely different format? So I think there's some really structural, legal, and kind of conceptions that have to be constructed. And if it isn't democracies leading in it, I think we'll be the victims of other people's conceptions and structures.
Okay, thanks. I think to me, one part of the boring revolution is really easy to understand. That is the necessity. I think we can all agree that if we look at the sustainability issues, if we look at the climate changes, if we look at the broken housing markets, it really cries out for doing something else. So the necessity, as you talk about, it's really easy to understand. What I find more difficult, and perhaps you could elaborate a bit on that, is to understand the new capabilities we're having. Because what you're saying is that technology is not only giving us another end result, but it's also giving us another way to deal with the issues, that we can do things, in other ways, organized differently and so on. So can you inform us a bit on how will new technologies give us new capabilities to deal with these issues?
Well, I mean, I'll go at a high level, but at a practical level. I think currently a lot of our thesis on the world has been constructed around the thesis of control. So much of our thesis of governance and regulation has been that on control. What's increasingly evident in a complex emergent world, control is very problematic, especially in a world of radical innovation. So, ex-ante ideas of regulation become really difficult to deliver because you're constantly innovating the new and generating risk that actually society ex-ante cannot predict. So there's a really interesting question for me about how do we govern and operationalize in a world which is not in that future, which is complex, emergent, and generating new risks. And that requires us to move away from the thesis of control as a viable paradigm to a thesis of ennoblement, where every actor becomes an agent through feedback, through recognition, a different type of relationship of regulation, which isn't about centralized control, but is a new model of ennoblement, which can actually deliver some of those issues, can reduce those mechanisms. So practical example is, do you want your car telling you, stopping at 30 kilometers an hour and saying we cannot travel any further? Or do you want your car to be able to say, actually, you are now speeding, this is the risk associated with that? How would you like that relationship constructed? Do we want to build a society built on control, or do we want a society built on ennoblement? What is the framework? And this is a conceptual frame of society. So I think one of the kind of interesting questions about how Sweden, for example, several colleagues of mine are based in Malmö and various other places, how Sweden has dealt with the pandemic is they've refused to do the lockdown. That's a very interesting position, both in terms of the thesis of democracy and the thesis of power as well. So I think we are at a paradigm shift on the relationship of how we deal with complexity and emergence. And the role of technology is going to be really critical. And we're already seeing with test and trace some of these kind of implications come to bear. But I think this is the head point that we're in the middle of, between the role of democracy the role of new bureaucratic technologies and what they can construct. And I think democracy is going to have to be reimagined in this thesis. And that's why I think the boring revolution is critical, because I think it has the capacity to build new democratic capabilities, radical democratic capabilities at the center of it, and new value models, right? New mechanisms of understanding value. We're doing some work around new ways of sharing value. So if you restore a piece of land, the tokenized value of that land can be shared with many other people. So there's new economies to be generated in formats that we're historically not used to as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only a political movement, it's also very much about construction and the economy that goes on there. I think that's important to state. I'll leave now the floor open for questions. And while you're thinking about what to ask, or what your doubts is about, just one question for you, Indy. I mean, is that something that we invented here that you invented in your head and that we invented over here, or what is the global status of the boring revolution, so to speak?
Okay, I think we've been talking about it for a while, all three of us, and BLOXHUB has been doing. Inevitably, this is now a global conversation in many, many different formats. I think there has been some work, there's some really extraordinary work going on, obviously, in China. There's some extraordinary work that's been going on in places like Singapore and Taiwan as well. So we're starting to see the emergence of these conversations. What I think is slightly different is when you look at it from a real estate perspective. Sidewalk Labs did some extraordinary works, I think, in terms of actually pushing some of the conversation forward, but they were nowhere near radical in terms of actually the value propositions that we were seeing on the table. So I would say that there is a kind of opportunity because the confluence of democracy and the deep democracy, which is what Denmark has, with the quality of environment, with the kind of digital infrastructure, that creates a unique environment to be able to construct some of these things. So whilst many people are talking about them, are they talking from a deep democratic perspective? Do they have the digital capabilities and the advanced economies to be able to deal with it? Or do they have the mature real estate industry to be able to actually look at those fine-grained values? So I think in that context, I think Copenhagen and Denmark is way advanced and very perfectly placed to be the lead market of some of these futures.
Okay, thank you once again. And Søren, there's I think we need the mic for the virtual part.
For me, sorry.
Hello. I'm Søren Hilbert. I'm a lawyer, actually, believe it or not. I'm struggling as well to understand all the concept that you are explaining. But being a Dane, having grown up in the Danish society, the only way that I can sort of see this brought further would be to make everything publicly owned. That all real estate should go back to the public entity to sort of to rearrange and that's the only way that I can imagine that this could be handled, and that is. But also, I wouldn't like that solution. So could you sort of elaborate a bit on that? What is the solution? How do we deal with all these values instead of just letting the owner of the property have all the benefits that maybe somebody else has created?
Yeah, so increasingly what we'd be looking at is the role of covenants, for example. So covenants are very interesting devices. They can be linked to where you can say, we will invest in, save the High Line. We're going to invest $178 million US dollars in building the High Line on the basis that if you have a land value uplift attributable to the High Line, you will share 10% of that land value uplift, just 10%. And in that format, you can construct covenants on people's land registry. At the point of trade, they will share their uplift value. So what we're looking at, and this sounds fantastic, but only fantastic to today's world, because the reality is business improvement districts have been making revenue calls on places already. Secondly, if you go back to the Boston Parks Trust, it already did exactly this. 10% of land value attributable to all houses adjacent to parks would be paid to back to the Parks Trust. And that Parks Trust, for example, now has 1.9 billion at its center. So in a strange way, this is not about going back to everything being in public. It's about everything recognizing its relationship to value in new radical formats, and its relationship to each other in new radical formats. So I think for me, what we're starting to see is this new type of contracting capability between these civic interventions and private value that is able to be constructed. So that's really, I think, where we're going, rather than actually assuming everything is public value, because I would agree with you that I don't think this is about putting everything into the hands of the state. I think what we're seeing is the state, in a way, going from the idea of a public to multiple publics, and the multiple publics being constructed in relationship with each other. And I think that's where I would go. And I think we're going to have to find new ways of doing that, because I don't think state top-down can construct that value and even create the legitimacy for that value, because I think these value exchanges are particular. Even like with the High Line, we saw the attribution of value in a very particular geography. It wasn't universal over Manhattan. And so if we're going to be able to do this fine-grained iteration of publics, I think we're going to have to be able to contract those values in different formats. So that's the way I would go. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't nationalize it. It's too cumbersome. I think what contracting is giving us the capacity to do is much more fine-grained thesis of public.
For me, the crucial part is to understand the difference between market, public, and then civic. And civic is decentralized, and that's another thing than going back to the, controlled state economy, so to speak. Just one very short comment, Søren, and then we're gonna...
Yeah, just as if the solution is covenants on the properties. One of the solutions should be that. Then either there should be voluntarily, so all the property owners should agree on that, so that they agree, everybody is agree that we should make this park, and we will all contribute and have this covenant registered on our property. The other solution would be, if you cannot have this unanimous agreement about that, then you need a legal basis to invoke it against the property owner as well. I guess, what are your thoughts about that?
So business improvement districts have done this historically by saying that they are enforced by, there's a capacity created by government that actually if 50% of the owners of businesses in an area agree to vote for it, then they will all be applicable to those shared contributions. So you can create legal structures that allow for a vote, but also a tipping point where that vote becomes manifest and adoptable to everyone. So I think this, and I think even in the design of that, so for example, in the work that we've been doing around that, we were looking at, for private property, you want it at the point of transaction. For commercial properties, you want it at the point of retail, leases being lease linked, revenue linked. So you have to be able to gear it. Otherwise, there's a challenge that you can drive a huge amount of unaffordability into the area as well. So yes, I mean, so there are two democratic structures, and you could explore others as well.
Yeah, I think we're going to pause here because we could clearly go on this ownership discussion. There was Zebra Architects. Perhaps you could state your name.
Yeah, my name is Mikkel from Zebra Architecture. I was just wondering if you have any more examples of contracts that have been done this way and that worked successfully at the more scales. It could also be smaller things, or kind of an interior scale or at building scale. Where this kind of contract has been implemented successfully, and the value measured and kind of been the basis of the contract.
Yeah, I think that was also my question for you. If you were to give one example that would demystify to all of us what the borrowing revolution is about, what would that be?
I mean, I would say the example that inspired me was the Boston Parks Trust. So the Boston Parks Trust in the 19th century built parks and built housing next to it. And on the housing, it put down a covenant, which basically said when you sell your housing, 10% of the uplift has to be paid back to the trust. Right? Now, they did it in an analog format. In the year 2015, it had 1.9 billion in its balance sheet, and it has been building parks throughout Boston. So what you have is this public infrastructure, which understood that public infrastructure civic infrastructure was creating value, and spilling that value over to the adjacent properties. And they've created a perpetual engine for building parks in Boston. So that's just a very simple answer. So I suppose what we're doing is taking the very same principle, understanding it using 21st century contracting capability, and how do you open that up for more fine-grained resolutions and to be able to retrofit that into existing neighborhoods in different formats. So that's just a really practical answer. There are larger scale versions of performance contracts and other things that are already in play, but they're all analog systems.
I hope that answered the question.
Part of it.
Part of it. Any add-on?
Yeah, I would also like to hear about other scales, smaller scales than the civic or public scale. Do you know about any examples at it's a private scale?
Perhaps I can also give an example on indoor climate in a few minutes.
That would be great.
Yeah. Indy, I would like to end by, because we have to proceed now, and what we'll do next, I mean, this is a launch in many ways. It is also a kind of a, I don't know if you call it a book, but a booklet, and that is a black white paper, which is a new thing to me. But I mean, it is also a launch of that, but first and foremost, it's a launch of a lab. And the lab, in my understanding, is all about experiments. So as a way to start up the next round, the idea is to do experiments in which we can test out the potential of the boring revolution in different areas. Could you tell us a bit on how will this lab work? I mean, what is it to do an experiment, and what kind of experiments are we looking for? Where is the right place to start?
Well, I would say the right place to start. What we're finding is that these, we're doing experiments like, for example, on looking at a micro community forest, or we're looking at examples of looking at new rental contracts. So, for example, if a rental contract for a restaurant was linked to footfall, which you can dynamically do, what would it do in terms of paying for public animation of the street? So what we're really interested in is these practical intervention points and interfaces which start to explore these realities. Or we know, for example, indoor air quality has massive, and sort of Mikkel will lead on this and sort of lead some really interesting questions on this. We know that parts per million, the CO2 levels in many buildings reaches over 1,000 parts per million, maybe even 1,500 parts per million. The cognitive performance of people declines massively in that process, let alone schools. Most buildings are performing that badly. So the reality is, how do you construct environments and construct new types of relationships to those outcomes? Are our buildings designed for optimizing people, or are they optimizing real estate? So what happens when you're starting to optimize people and unlock their full capacity, as opposed to optimizing their utilization? How would you create and curate space? What would a rental contract look like, which is linked to productivity, which I think many people have been exploring in a large scale way? How do we be able to construct that? So what we're looking at is these interface moments that start to open this stuff up. We're also looking at structuring of a perpetual bond as a new way of financing. So what we're historically been looking at is these little intervention points that allow us, almost like probes, then explore into the deeper system. And I think that's really key part of it, is start small, probe into everything.
Yeah. So yeah. Think big, start small, and find these small interventions where we could actually test out the idea. And that's the next thing we're going to do. And I think you're going to stay with us a bit more, and we might even continue in English, I guess. So what we'd like to do for the next half an hour or so is to dig into some issues that we would propose as very obvious or interesting starting point for doing experiments. And just a bit of a recap, but perhaps also to say why, as a company, it's interesting for us in Smith Innovation to be part of this boring lab. I think one way of putting this is that I think we all realize, if we look at our daily lives, that there isn't a before and after we got the internet. This before and after things become digital. If we look at the way we find our information, how we read our news, how we buy our stuff, how we find our sweet house, how politics is made. I mean, there's a before and after on how money, sweet house and politics is made due to the internet. I think that's really clear for all of us. And what we're asking here is the quite simple question: what if the same before and after is also going for the way we collaborate and make arrangement within the built environment? So that is a simple idea. We know that there is the before and after in a lot of areas. We think there's also a before and after in the way we arrange things in the built environment. And perhaps and that is also going back to what you talked about, Indy, perhaps we got this whole idea about connectivity a bit wrong, because we have been looking at what connectivity does to the city and to building and to stuff. And that is what we sometimes call the smart city. Perhaps the really interesting question is, at least also the really interesting question is, what does it do with people and the way people interact? And that is, to me, what the boring revolution is about. And in order to kind of make this a bit more specific, we have been doing 3 explorations in half a year ago, or a bit more even. And I just want to give you a few highlights from these explorations in order to perhaps illustrate that this, at one hand, is perhaps a very abstract thing, but at the other hand, it's also something that is quite tangible in the things that it can solve. So we did 3 explorations about indoor climate in schools, about circularity, and about what to do with the rising sea levels and coastal protection. And in these explorations, we addressed different themes. What will mean for the one who owns the city, for the one who uses the city, and for the one who creates the city, also the designers. So I think what we learned is that looking at for first schools and indoor environment, I mean here the real absurd thing is that it doesn't pay to make a good indoor environment for the kids. I mean it's so obvious it does pay, but somehow the construction industry is not able to make it pay to look at the indoor and improve the indoor environment. So how do we put the people in the schools first? And one of the problem we experience is that obviously energy savings are really easy to monitorize, but indoor climate is not easy to monitorize. So perhaps we could have contractual schemes where, as you talked about, Torben, contractors, designers are not paid for the hours or material spent, but for the actual indoor improvement they are creating in the schools. And we will be able to measure that to a much higher extent than we have been capable at present. Another thing is that indoor climate is really difficult to see. We got a lot of wonderful techniques now for displaying it in a way that is understandable. So it's now not this hidden thing anymore. So perhaps we can have people with supersight say, hey, actually the indoor climate is really bad. And I know some people who's working on that part, looking at you, Mikkel, for instance. So that was one exploration and a few highlights from that one. The second one we had was about flooding and the climate resilient city. And I think what is another painful observation here is that we do not dare to do things right. If you go out and talk to the municipalities in Denmark, they say over and over again that we know that this solution would be the right thing to do to protect our cities and create long-term value. We have no doubt, but we take this one. Because that's the one we can handle, that's the one we can make decisions on, that's the one we can find money for. So we take solutions that we know are wrong. And one of the problems is, of course, that we're not able to harvest all the benefits that are distributed across so many actors and to make that pay for the solution. So what if we could create some kind of contractual schemes by which we, as you're talking about it by the High Line, could actually see the benefits of making new multi-benefit solutions and use that in order to pay for these multi-benefit solutions so that we need so badly. So that would be another thing on paying according to performance, but also another way of coordinating multi-benefit solutions in different ways. And the last example is on circular construction. And I mean, the fundamental observation here is once again that it doesn't pay to save the planet in the long term. I mean, we have own interest in what we put into construction. We have no interest in what has been taken out and what can be reused. I mean, all the business models today is about putting things in, and no one is caring about taking things out and making it useful for another observation or another use of resources. And one observation here is that regulation treats recyclable things as waste, and we have a regulation that is made on very rude categories, and perhaps we, by this more fine-grained way of observing how buildings is doing, could see waste in a much more nuanced way. So that could be one of the things that we could address by the boring revolution. Perhaps also the more obvious one, that we will actually be able to say what is in buildings, where is it positioned, how can it be reused. We will know where stuff are. So just to give you an example, some examples that when we during these explorations look at all the tough challenges for some of the really critical issues, we think it's likely that the boring revolution will have some answers to this in a quite specific way. And to me, that was a quite revealing thing to experience. What we'd like to do today is to build on some of these challenges. However, we also propose 2 new ones. Because that's probably a bit more in line with the people who's here, and also the discussion we have been having for the last half year after we did the explorations. So what we would suggest is that it would be interesting for the next, I don't know,
30 minutes.
next 30 minutes, to break out in 4 sessions, discussing each of these themes. 1, schools and indoor environment or climate, flooding and the climate resilient city. And 3rd, what we have called, and we're looking for a better term, and I think, Thomas, you'll be able to help us out, also as you are perhaps the test case for this one, Torben has arranged. But the new office, but other ways of measuring the value that is created when we work, and perhaps also another rental contract for the office, where you have agreed perhaps to be like a guinea pig for that exploration. And 4th and finally, the example that you've been talking a lot about today in the natural assets in the city, the Boston Park example, or the trees example. And the questions we like to ask to you in these small groups or short group session is: why do you think the boring revolution is important to that theme? What will be, and that is perhaps the most crucial question, what will be the obvious place to start? I mean, what is the example that we really would like to start out with? I mean, we have, for the new ways of office, we have this idea that we could test it out with a rental contract for you, Thomas, here in BLOXHUB, and we would like to find similar specific places where we could do this. And obviously, if some of you is having something in mind, Søren, if you knew of a contract that you could do with Randers Kommune and Byen til Vandet as you work on, that would be really great. And then perhaps finally also a reflection on how you as a company or organization will benefit from this. So that's the idea to split up, but I just need a bit of a voting pool here, because to see if we are having 4 groups really. How many would like to sign up for the schools and the indoor environment stuff? I was counting on you for that one. And 2, so we have 3 perhaps. How many will go on the flooding and the climate resilient city? 2, 2 small groups so far. The new office thing, that was a banger. Okay. And obviously the natural assets in the city. That was 2, okay.
When you're talking about natural assets in the city, you're talking about nature.
Yeah.
But natural assets could be also assets, people.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We're talking about nature. The title is perhaps not the best one. We're talking about nature, biodiversity, and so on. Could I suggest perhaps that the natural assets and the flooding and the climate resilient cities, that was joined forces, because there are some overlaps there, and then we have a group, and then we have a small but very powerful group on the first one. And
You had a comment?
It depends a bit what schools and indoor environment is, because it might be that they go in hand with the new office. So this might be the same issues discussed.
That's true. Might be.
Yeah, okay.
Because
So
the indoor climate is obviously important also in the office.
That's actually
Or
what we
not.
study.
yeah, okay. Right. So the suggestion is here basically to form 2 groups then.
I think it's better to integrate them rather than having a group with 2 people.
Right. So this is what we're going to do.
Let's do that.
It's one person.
So Torben.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So where are we going to? So we're going to have one group working with schools indoor environment and the new office.
And the new office idea.
Yeah.
And we will be working just at the big table just outside here in the members' lounge. Before you leave, there will be some coffee in the break, but now the break is over. So grab a cup of coffee and we'll go directly to the group sessions.
And the other one, Torben, is going to be.
It's a bit more. We go to the virtual lab and we have an assistant because. Yeah, it can be got. We will depart now in group sessions, so all you watching online on YouTube, of course, Thanks for joining. Thanks for taking part. We hope it makes sense. We'll be back in the lab. Make no mistake about that. So thank you. And to the rest of you.